Thank you. This is exciting to be here today. When I ran into Tim at the library and we were trying to come up with a date that I could come and speak, and we selected January, and I thought that seemed like kind of a crazy time to do an event like this in Falmouth. And then I realized that there is so much going on in Falmouth in January. It's the perfect time to do something. So I'm really excited to be here. So this is, whoops, well, let's not start that way. This is the front cover of my book, and the house that you see here, minus this, is the house that my husband and I purchased in Woods Hole in 2018. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But just wanted you to know what it looked like. And this is just so that you have an idea of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to tell you who I am and why Woods Hole. And I want to walk through a little bit the timeline of the research and the writing of the book. What were the research tools that I used? A little bit about what the book is about, and then some vignettes that I picked up along the way. And there are a lot of different things I could talk about, so hopefully I've settled on some that are of interest to you. I want to start with a question, though, because you're all here for a reason. You're all here with an interest in genealogy, and I'm curious as to, for the people in the FGS, what sparks your interest in genealogy? What are the questions that you're looking to answer, and then what are you going to do with it? You know, I was amused by Ralph saying he's got these boxes of things. What are you going to do with that once you work your way through it? So does anybody want to answer that question for me, of people in the audience? No? Oh.
I was curious about what they, how they died, what did they die on? Could it have been prevented?
Excellent. That's actually really interesting, because I have found, it's kind of morbid, I have found death to be very interesting part of my research process. And I have visited more cemeteries than I ever thought I would in my life. So, and I've gone as far as cemeteries in Illinois in the research of my book. So, so that's interesting. Anyone else?
Hold on.
I have the journals from my great-great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother and my grandfather on shipboard. All their journals for how many years? Journal, and whether I would want it to address children or adults or both.
Great.
Yeah, I'll do both. How about?
Okay. Is there anyone else that, no. Is there anyone else that wants to share?
Yeah, I'll get that one.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, I didn't know what I was going to do, and so I traced my family back to Mayflower and to a lot of the DAR patriots that I'm descended from. And this was important to me because I basically inherited my tree, but I didn't know whether it was in fact correct. And so by doing it through the lineage societies, I was able to have some confidence that looked right.
And did you find some errors?
Oh, yes. But I was amazed at all the free materials that are out there that pointed me in the right direction. So I was blessed.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Okay, so now that...
So Elizabeth, I'll take the people with both now, okay? In the audience.
Okay, well, if anyone else wants to, yeah, that'd be great. Okay, so who am I? So I am, unlike most of you in the room, I am a first-generation American, or some people would say I'm a second-generation American, because I was actually born in this country, but I was born of, my parents are both from England, and they came over here permanently about 6 months before I was born. So I like to say in my family, I am the first intentional American. My oldest sister was born in Scotland, and my next sister was born while my parents were going back and forth with work temporarily. So I grew up in Northern California, and I went to Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Yes, one of my classmates is back here, where I majored in history, and then proceeded to never technically use my history degree again. I married a boy from Natick and became a New Englander because you really have no choice when you marry a boy from Natick. I have 3 children. They are Red Sox fans, Patriots fans, Celtics fans, Bruins fans. And it helps that my son was born in 1998, and not too long after that, the Red Sox finally won a World Series, to which he responded, "I've waited my whole life for this." I was a retail executive for 35 years. I worked for G-Fox, for any of you that have Connecticut roots or Rhode Island roots. I worked for Hecht's down in the DC area, and then for Macy's. And then after that, I went to work for the White House Historical Association. But I worked in retail. So I did use my history degree finally, but I was still in retail. When I graduated from Trinity, I really thought about going into journalism, even though I was a history major, going into retail, because that was sort of, a good job, or running a bed and breakfast. So now I've kind of come full circle and done all those different pieces of it. And this is my first book. My next book is going to be a murder mystery. I ripped from the headlines 1937, based on a story I learned about through Ancestry.com. So a timeline for the book, or the house, really. My husband and I purchased the house on Eel Pond in 2018 after I had been obsessing over it for a year, trying to figure out, what was about the house. The house was built in 1890. Okay, well, actually, the house wasn't built in 1890. We were told it was built in 1890. The people we bought the house from, the Roslanskys, told us it was built in the 1930s. That's a pretty big spread. So I immediately dove into researching the history of the house. The previous owners, I could go through and find the previous owners fairly quickly, but trying to figure out the actual age of the house was really, really difficult. September 2018, we have done some renovations in the house, and my mother-in-law, Helen, who's in the front row here, had moved into the house, and where she lives full-time, year-round. And we're talking in her apartment one day, and she's on the phone, and she says, "Who did you buy the house from?" And I said, "The Roslanskys." Into the phone, "The Roslanskys." I said, "That is a very strange question. Why are you asking me who we bought the house from?" She said, "Well, my friend Mary," who she was talking to on the phone, "had an uncle who had a house in Woods Hole." And it sounded kind of familiar. The seawall that's in front of our house sounded very familiar. And I said, "Well, what was her uncle's name?" And she said, "Nickerson, Joseph Nickerson." And I said, "Well, the house, the property, was first owned by Walter Nickerson." It was the same house. She had been in the house in 1938, just after the hurricane had hit. And they came down to survey the damage, and she was 6 years old. She was not allowed to go out onto the seawall. Her sister was allowed to go on the seawall. She was not allowed to. But she remembered the interior of the house, and we determined that Helen's apartment, because the house has been broken into apartments, Helen's apartment was the living room. She remembered the grand piano in the corner, and she remembered some of the details of it. And I thought, what are the odds of that connection? She also went on to tell me that Walter, that her uncle's father, who had built the house, that he was a sea captain. And several people that had come in to do work on the house had said, "Oh, this is a sea captain's house." I didn't really know what that meant. So it made sense. She said he was a sea captain. And that the family had a few of the trinkets that he had brought back from his voyages to China. So one of the trinkets was a teacup. And so recently, I have become friends with the family as a result of this, and they gave me the set of teacups that they had that were from Walter's voyages to China. The problem is, in the research of this book, I discovered that Walter was not a sea captain. He was a mailman, I guess he was a sea captain because his route was to Tarpaulin Cove on Noshawn Island. So every day he would make that route. He would pick up the mail at the train, and he would take the boat over to Tarpaulin Cove. Depending on what the tides were doing, he would check his lobster traps because he was a lobster man. And then he checked them on the way back, and he'd bring the mail back. So these did not come from his sea voyages to China, clearly. I suspect, and I'd love anybody that's an expert in antiques, because I haven't taken these anywhere. I suspect that this was a child's China set that was purchased somewhere along the way to just continue the story going along, because I'm pretty sure that these are sort of a made in Taiwan kind of China set. But I love having them, and to know that they were in the house 100 years ago is still pretty cool. Oh, where'd my thing go? Okay, so in January of 2022, I quit my job at the White House Historical Association so that I could focus full-time on this story, because what I learned over the years was that there were really interesting people that lived in our house. And I really wanted to write a book. I'd always wanted to write a book, and so I wanted to do that. And amazingly, in January of 2022, after 4 years of research, I finally figured out when the house was built. It was not a coincidence. When you're doing these things, it's very, very important not to get too distracted. And I was constantly being distracted. So 3 weeks into full-time research, I was able to figure out that our house was built in 1916. So that was very exciting. That was a really stellar day. Just so that I walked through the process, the first draft of my book was completed in December. The fifth draft, or probably the 8th or 12th draft, was completed in July. I literally started from the beginning of the book and went through it like 8 times. And every time I would cross out more. And in September 2023, the book proposal was accepted, and this is just to let you know, the final transcript and images were submitted to the publisher. Woods Hole Historical Museum, Sally and Colleen were amazing helping me get the images pulled together. And then I had a launch in July of 2024 in Woods Hole. Okay, so the research tools that I used, I'd be curious as I go through these if you would raise your hand if these are research tools that you've used, because I'm interested to know sort of the research tools people use. So the very first place I went to was the Barnstable County Registry of Deeds. They have records going back to 1686. They had a big fire in 1827 and lost quite a few records. But from 1827 on, they pretty much have everything. And it's all available online. So have any, I'm assuming that there are people here that have really used that. Okay. It was amazing to me because I did 95% of my research in Arlington, Virginia, most of it during COVID. So being able to access these records is amazing. And I will tell you, I live in Arlington, Virginia, which was, first sort of explored in 1607. So it's not exactly a newcomer. They've got nothing. They've got nothing on what Massachusetts has as far as records go. And I have a very difficult time trying to find the same information about my house in Arlington, which was built in 1924. So I really appreciate it. Falmouth Enterprise Archives. If you haven't used the Falmouth Enterprise Archives, and it goes back to what Tim talked about, they are searchable, and they are searchable at a fine level of detail. It is the most impressive archive I've come across, and I've looked at a lot, including the Washington Post. The Washington Post, you cannot find the level of detail as quickly as you can on the Falmouth Enterprise, where you can isolate words or you can expand words. And that was how I figured out when the house was built, because I was able to come across a thing that said who had been given the contract for the plumbing and who had been given the contract for the electricity, and that Franklin Gifford had been given the contract for painting the interior of the house. And Franklin Gifford owned the property right next door to our house. So that was really exciting to see. The Woods Hole Historical Museum, I can't say enough good things. The maps that they have are just unbelievable, and the images, again, all available online, are incredible. And I went through all 4,000 of them to find various pictures of the house during the 38 hurricane, during the 54, it was amazing to find these things. Falmouth Public Libraries, where I met Tim, but also just being able to research and find various books. Museums on the Green. The Nickerson Family Association in Chatham, if you haven't gone there, it is a gem. I did a book talk there in September, and they have people come from all over the country to come to their reunions and events that are there. Massachusetts State Archives in Dorchester. How many of you have ever been to the Massachusetts State Archives? How many of you just love using microfiche machines? It was so cool. What was really neat when I went to the Massachusetts State Archives, I found two things when I was there. The first thing I found was that I found Walter Nickerson, who built our house in 1916. I found his death certificate. And that was a tremendous relief because I just assumed that Walter Nickerson, because I knew he had died kind of suddenly in 1925, I assumed he died in our house. And I was very relieved to find out that he died in a hospital up in Boston. So, one less ghost in our house, which was really a relief for me. And the second thing I found, which I'll talk about in just a minute, is I found the birth certificate for Dorothy Nickerson. So I'll get to that in just a minute. And then Ancestry.com and newspapers.com, I'm assuming everybody here uses those. And if you don't, they are just tremendous tools. Oral history from local experts. So that is really fun. And then the Church of the Messiah cemetery records. Yeah?
Is the Massachusetts State Archives available online?
Some of it. Some of it is available online, but the microfiche pieces, they'll tell you where to find things, but then you have to go and look at them yourselves. But it is really a fun exercise to do, but you have to be patient. Because I had to go through 3 years worth of documents to find what I was looking for. So for those of you that are into cemetery records, it was wonderful because they had the cemetery records for Church of the Messiah, and I was able to find a missing member of the family that I had no record of, and there she was. I found her burial plot. This one, if any of you are in Woods Hole anytime soon, I highly recommend going and finding my friend Arthur Nickerson. Arthur died in a boat accident in 1906. He was showing off. He was taking the mail for his brother. He was filling in for his brother with a friend of his who happened to be either then or just after the organist at the Church of the Messiah. And he was showing him what a great boat he had. And he did something, and the boat, it had no reaction on the boat. It wasn't adrenaline rushing enough for him. So he ended up standing up somehow on the boat in a way that caused the boat to capsize. And with a very, very quick tide, and he ended up dying. So this is his gravestone, and I apologize, it's really hard to see here, but his name is spelled incorrectly. And it's a very fine gravestone. It's, this big, it's beautiful, it's polished, and yet his name is spelled incorrectly. Anyone that can tell me or figure out for me why his name is spelled incorrectly, I'd be eternally grateful, because it just is so strange to have spent that much money on a gravestone and have it be wrong. I asked the question about whether mistakes have been found on your family tree, and the reason is because I discovered in this process how very, very inaccurate a lot of this information is. And I kind of expected a few things here and there. I mean, 30% of the information in some cases is inaccurate on some of the census data that I found. So here is an example of one. There were 9 Nickerson children. So let me back up for 1 second. Walter, who built our house, grew up at Nobska Light. His father was Oliver Nickerson, who was the longest serving lightkeeper at Nobska Light. So he and his 8 siblings all lived in that one small keeper's house that was there before they did the addition. So there were 9 Nickerson children listed at Nobska Light in 1900. And here's the census data. So the parents, and then these are all the children, and then there's 2 grandchildren down here, ages 2 and, well, I can't remember how old they are now. I can't read it too carefully. So that seemed very straightforward. It was sort of, I knew who all the children were, and all of that was fine. But then I was looking for something completely different, as often happens in these searches, and I found Minnie, the daughter number 2, and she was living at Josephine Swift's boarding house. But Minnie is listed here, Mary A., that was Minnie, on the data. So here she is again, Minnie Nickerson. So then I looked a little further, because you can just kind of go through everything that was taken in Woods Hole and Falmouth. Vesta, the oldest daughter, was married and living with her husband and son on High Street in Woods Hole, and had been for 13 years. It wasn't like she just got married. Clara was living on Main Street with a man who would become her very philandering husband in Falmouth. Herman, the youngest son, was a boarder at the home of Edward Crowell on Main Street. Nettie was married and living in Washington, D.C. And then the two grandchildren, Bertha might have been Elizabeth, who was Nettie's daughter. Nettie's daughter, there was a divorce, and so she was living with her grandparents at times. So that might have been her. But Roger, who was indeed a grandchild, had died at 2 months old, 10 years earlier. So half of the people listed on that census were erroneous, double counted, or whatever. And that was just one. That was just one census. Okay, so what is the book about? Walter was a 9th generation Cape Cod Protestant. He was part of the Nickersons that founded Chatham in 1654, I believe it was. And he married Helena Nugent, who was a 1st generation Irish immigrant Catholic. I don't know how they met. I can only assume she was a school teacher. I only can assume that she came to Woods Hole for a vacation of some sort, and they met. He converted to Catholicism, and they got married in Clinton, Massachusetts, but then lived their whole life in Woods Hole. So the book is about Woods Hole itself. It's about old houses. It's about the fact that there are interesting people in every family, in every house, in every story. And it's also about serendipity, which is, I think, 90% of genealogy is just coming across information that you may not even have been looking for. Resilience of going back at it after you go down a dead end. And then the grit that really, I mean, those are the features of people that survived in Woods Hole over 400 years, but it's also very important as you're doing genealogy because there are so many roadblocks that come up. Oh, I'm sorry, wait a minute. Can I go back? Okay, let me go back. The picture on the side was actually given to me by the same person that gave me the teacups. And it is a picture of Joseph Nickerson, the son of the builder of our house, and his wife Frances. And I was given the picture and told that this was from their honeymoon. They got married about 2 weeks after the hurricane of 1938. And I was told this was from their honeymoon, and they went to, I think, New Hampshire. I don't know if any of you, how familiar you are. Does anybody recognize that picture? You know where it is? Somebody tell me where it is? It's Mary's Garden, yes. So Mary's Garden is 2 doors down from our house. And I looked at the picture that I had, very clearly said it was taken on their honeymoon in New Hampshire, and I thought, no, it wasn't. This was taken in Mary's Garden, and I stood it up, and sure enough, there's no question it's Mary's Garden. So this must have been taken when they got engaged, because clearly the hurricane hadn't come through yet. Everything's fairly intact. Okay, so now we go on to my vignette section. So people ask me a lot, why on earth we bought this house in Woods Hole. We are not people that were fortunate enough to come in summer here, for 3 or 4 months every year. But the roots in Woods Hole go deep within my husband's family. So his father, when he was in high school, used to come in the summer and work at the MBL. And he worked in the kitchens, which I find amusing because the man never stepped foot in the kitchen, as far as I can remember. He was not a cook. But the story was always that he peeled potatoes at the MBL. And it was always put that way. I peeled potatoes at the MBL. So we always knew about Woods Hole, and it was his favorite place. I think never has he been happier than sitting at the Captain Kidd and eating a bowl of chowder. So my husband and I, whenever we could, after we got married, we'd always come and spend a week here, usually Columbus Day, because that's when I could get off. And so I'm going through and I'm researching the book, and somebody said to me, if you want to find pictures of your house, look through the MBL archives. They're available online, and they have all kinds of interesting pictures. So I'm looking through the MBL archives, looking for pictures of the house, mind you, and I come across a picture called Peeling Potatoes at the MBL. I don't think if it had been called anything else, I would have looked at it so closely. So I called my mother-in-law and I said, my father-in-law died unfortunately before we purchased the house in Woods Hole. But I said, when was Tom peeling potatoes at the MBL? And she said, 1951, I think. So I'm looking at the picture. And then I looked at it a little more closely. And this is the spitting image of my husband. That's his father. None of us knew this picture existed. And we never would have looked at it if we hadn't realized. Now, just for accuracy's sake, we've been told he'd been peeling potatoes at the MBL. He's actually cutting tomatoes at the MBL. They're peeling potatoes at the MBL. But we're gonna let him get by on that one. We also started looking through some of my mother-in-law's pictures, and we came across this one. I call this playing ball. Oh, well, now I've told you where it is. This was just a picture that was in there. I don't think you knew where it was, right? You just had the picture. And those of you, again, that know Woods Hole will recognize this as the ballpark at the end of Bell Tower Lane. And if you go, which I did, and you take the picture, you can still see that house. And the tennis courts are in the same location. So there's a few things that have shifted a bit. And amazingly, and my son went on to play catcher in baseball for years. So this is just a really cool picture because none of us knew what its significance were. But that's why we have such an affinity for Woods Hole. The other thing was this. So does anybody recognize this? Did any of you have this on the wall of your house? Probably most of you. Whenever I show it to somebody from Falmouth, they all perk up and recognize it. So this drawing hung on the wall of my in-laws' house in their dining room ever since I've known them, I think going back to the 70s. And so again, loved the fact that it was Woods Hole. So our house is right here. And if you look at it, actually when it's blown up, you can really see it. It's been erased, which I don't take offense to because I found out the reason was that somebody informed the artist that it was too busy and she needed to kind of clean it up a little bit. So there's a few things that have been erased. So it's not a picture that exists. She couldn't ever get this view, and so she kind of took her favorite buildings and made the picture out of it. So it's not absolutely true to Woods Hole. But the artwork was created by Robyn Kanwisher, who some of you would know as Susie. Her sister is Dr. Nancy Kanwisher. And their mother was Joan Kanwisher. And so she did a lot of prints and things that were sold where Pie in the Sky is now. It was a different building then. She's also, if you didn't know, she is the power behind the Shining Sea Bikeway. And apparently that was a very uphill battle to try and get that bikeway in. So we have her to thank for that. Apparently the family was all semi-artistic, some very artistic and some semi-artistic, but every year they would have a Christmas contest of who was going to draw the Christmas card. And I didn't include a picture in here, but Nancy won one year, or sorry, Robyn won one year with a Christmas tree made of toadfish. And I thought, only in Woods Hole would you have a Christmas tree made of toadfish. It was the cutest thing. Anyway, so that painting, or that print now hangs in the front hallway of our house on Millfield Street. And if anyone's interested, I have canvas bags that have it on there as well, which are kind of fun. Okay, so my last vignette is Who is Dorothy? And this was going to be the name of my book, and I hope I don't lose you in the process because this is a confusing vignette. When I was first researching, so Walter Nickerson built the house. He had one child named Joseph Nickerson. Because Mary was the niece of Joseph Nickerson, I was well aware that Joseph had no children. And so I found their census data from 1940 when they were living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So here's Joseph, here's Francis. All the information checks out. So I thought, I'm going to print this. This is going to be good to have this information. So I printed it. And I don't know how well you can see this, but over here we have Joseph Nickerson and Francis Nickerson and Dorothy Nickerson, age 14. Well, she wasn't on here, and I wasn't looking for her, but the reason is she was the very first entry on the next page. If I hadn't printed it, I never would have even known that was there. Here's the problem. It's the only time I've ever seen Dorothy Nickerson associated with Joseph and Frances. So my mind being what it is in the 21st century, I naturally assumed she was, these two had married 2 years before, so I knew she wasn't their child. And Joseph would have been 17 when he would have a 14-year-old child. So I assumed that maybe she was an illegitimate daughter. He had been sent off to boarding school, and I had a whole scenario in my mind of who Dorothy Nickerson was. What I did uncover is I uncovered a Dorothy Nickerson, age 4, ward of the state in Massachusetts in the 1930 census. I mean, that has to be it. There's just no way it could be anything else but my Dorothy Nickerson that I'm looking for. I was also able to determine there were only 6 Dorothy Nickersons born in Massachusetts in sort of the rough time frame. So what I discovered is that I was able to trace this Dorothy Nickerson, and she was adopted by the Young family. They were in Winchester, Massachusetts, and Erie, Pennsylvania. There was a Howard C. Nickerson that was adopted by the family and changed his name to Howard Young. Okay? He had been living, when Dorothy Nickerson, age 4, ward of the state, was there, he was living with Joseph Nickerson, makes it a little confusing with the name, in Everett, Massachusetts. Again, I'm sorry if I'm confusing people. It took me a long time to work my way through this. Howard died, and after he died, his sister through adoption, that's all we knew at that point, got into genealogy and went and found her roots, and she connected herself to Howard C. Nickerson Sr. and Mildred Lyle as her birth parents. And in her obituary in 2008, she made no mention of growing up in Pennsylvania, no mention of the Young family. She listed her I shouldn't say she, because she was dead. Her brother was listed as Howard Nickerson, even though he never went by Howard Nickerson, and he's buried as Howard Young. And it all talked about her favorite places in the world were Cape Cod and Nova Scotia, which is where Mildred and Howard Nickerson were from. And no mention of her upbringing in Pennsylvania, even though she'd lived there until she was, I think, 50. So I naturally assumed that she just connected herself with this family and took on their genealogy and just decided that this was what her life was. So I was still sort of going with the illegitimate daughter theory. I finally tracked down, as I said, Dorothy Nickerson in the archives, and I found her birth record that she indeed was the daughter of Mildred and Howard. Howard died when she was 2 in an accident, and her mother gave her up and went on and remarried and started a new family and never came back and reunited. She got married 2 years after she had given her up, but never came back and took her on. And so, I'm sure that plays into it. But then the question is, who is Dorothy? Who is Dorothy Nickerson that is on the 1940 census with Joseph and Frances? So anyone out there that wants to help me figure that one out, that will be the subject of another book. Because that, if I could have figured it out, that would have been a huge chapter here. I made a decision since I couldn't figure it out, and I didn't really want to upset the family of Dorothy Young Nickerson. I left much of it out. But it was amazing. It took me months and months and months to get to the bottom of the rabbit hole and realize it was a complete dead end. But I learned a lot in the process, and it did make me realize how genealogy is fact, but some of it can be fiction. And, you got to tease those two out. So, and that's it. Those are my vignettes.
So I will field questions here, okay?
Okay.
I'll hold it for you.
What's the date of that 1940 census?
You mean which time of year, April or when?
Yeah,
I haven't.
I asked that because I think, was she in fact visiting there and got
She
listed?
may have been.
Somehow she found them and,
Yeah, it was in Cambridge, and so the question would be, was she visiting or was she in school? But even if she was visiting, where'd she come from? Who is she? And I've tracked every other Dorothy Nickerson that was born in Massachusetts and haven't found her. Now, if indeed my theory on the illegitimate daughter thing, which, seems a little crazy, but he was in school in New Hampshire. So it's possible I could find it in New Hampshire, but I haven't gotten into New Hampshire yet. So,
good digging.
yeah, a lot of digging. Any other questions?
Wait, Sandra, wait.
Okay. You mentioned the train. I don't know if people are aware that there was a train that used to come into Woods Hole, and it would be easier transportation for people to come in and out. And that might be of interest in terms of trying to figure out where she might have come from to come into Woods Hole.
Well,
It was much easier to get to than what people, I think, realize.
right. That census was taken in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They were living in Cambridge at the time, not in Woods Hole. So I'm not sure whether that would. But the train actually plays a big role in my book, because one of the things I talk about is the history of Woods Hole and how it was always able to find the next thing as an industry died, which I have found fascinating because for 400 years it's thrived. And the train was critical to being able to do that, to switch from whaling into fertilizer.
My husband's family used to come by that train from New York every weekend.
Isn't that
and then
amazing
get the
that
train
people
back.
came? Yeah, I missed the train.
Yeah.
I wish it were there.
And it used to be a fish market, I think, before that.
Mm-hmm.
I think was that.
Mm-hmm.
That's,
Hi there. I'm interested in place as you are, but I'm curious whether you've delved into your own genealogy. This law of effort, most of us, I think, are interested in finding out our ancestors and how we're descended, but have you looked into your own genealogy?
That is such a good question, because I was going to close with this, actually. I had never looked in, and I actually write about this in my book, I had never looked into my own genealogy because most people are trying to figure out how close they can get to the Mayflower. I mean, that's a big thing. And I knew when my parents came over, I knew what flight number they came over on. But as a result of doing this, I kind of have become the resident expert in my family on genealogy. My sister was going to Scotland last year, so I knew both of my grandfathers had died before my parents even married. So I knew little bits about things, but my sister was going to Scotland, and she wanted to see if I could help her find a little something about our Scottish roots. And in the process of doing that, I discovered that my grandfather had 4 siblings. One had died very young, but the other 3 2 of them had, they all left Scotland. One of them stayed, the other ones left Scotland, but one went to China, and one went to Spain, and one went to somewhere else. They had a disagreement with their new stepfather, apparently. And in the process, I found a cousin that none of us knew existed. And she had never met a family member in her life, and she lives in South Africa. And I'm going to South Africa at the end of the month, and I'm going to meet her. So I will be the first family member first relative she's ever met outside of her parents, which is going to be really cool. So the answer is yes, but I never would have done that. My sister never would have called me to say, can you do this, if I hadn't done this. And the other thing that was really interesting, I did the international ancestry because I was trying to find the Irish roots of the whole family. And as a result of that, I was able to find the gravesite of our great-grandparents and our great-great-grandparents. No one in my family has ever been to the gravesite of a relative, ever.
Where was that?
So it's in Tain, Scotland. Tain, T-A-I-N. And we were able to find, and they're beautiful. I mean, they're huge, huge stones, beautiful stones. So my sister was able to visit, and it's the first time anyone in my family's ever been to a gravesite of a family member. So that was pretty cool. Okay?
Any others? Okay.
I'm also first generation. I can relate. Yeah, good for us, or good for them for bringing it over, I guess. Ironically, and this doesn't pertain to American, but a few years ago we went back to my father's hometown in Italy, and ran into a fellow over there who, dad, after we had the same last name, we wanted to know we were related, and that kind of thing. And in searching all of that, this young man's father, after we got home, wanted to know what my email was, and he sent me from my grandfather's generation, back to 1711.
Wow.
And I, of course, was thrilled to receive it and wanted to do something for the gentleman. And he said, "Oh, don't worry." He said, "My father used to be the registrar of the town, and it's all on microfilm." And that's how he got all that lineage going back. Of course, it's a small town, so maybe it was an easy find for him, but it was great for me. And the irony of all of that is between 1780 and 1812, there was a priest involved in the lineage who fathered 4 children. So I'm sure the Catholic Church had a big bump in the road when it came to that.
Yeah, I think that was probably not as rare a thing in those days as
Right,
one
really.
might think.
And then the second thing I was wondering was the tenor of the times that we go through sometimes. When you run into dead ends, there are those skeletons in the closet that nobody ever wanted anybody to talk about, and I think those people got lost along the way.
I think that's true. And one of the things that I noticed on the census data was people would lie about their age. They would lie about their marital status. And so you would find people gradually ease in from they would be a widow, and then they would gradually ease into being divorced.
Yes.
And you'd see that. And yeah, I think you're right. I think that a lot of people would just sort of deny some of those things were happening. So.
Sandra, and wait. All right, here we go.
Actually, in terms of lying about information, that brought me here initially, and Ralph and Tim were trying to help me figure out a problem with the fact that my great-grandmother was from Scotland, and my son called and he had done a DNA swab or something, and he said there was a percentage of Irish, and then I did it, and I came up very high Irish, and had red hair. My kids had red hair. But my great-grandmother had identified as being from Scotland. And so Ralph said to me that at the time that she came, it would have been better to identify herself as being
right.
from Scotland.
Irish need not
because the
apply.
Irish were not well accepted.
Yep.
And that's exactly what she did. So Ralph had pointed this out to me, that she probably lied. And through the research, I found the name McIntyre, and it's all ended up that a woman in England contacted me, and she had been a cousin, and she had found all this information out and said we were related as cousins, 4th cousins. She had the name of the church, she had pictures of the graveyard where all the McIntyres were buried, and she could prove the link that I had never been able to prove. But it all started with a lie.
Yeah,
on the census.
I hope you're taking a trip over there to check it all out.
I had a trip planned with my son. Unfortunately, COVID hit, so we're going to try again, in the next year. And then on the other side, my father's family was supposedly related to Betsy Ross, and through the Find a Grave thing that we did here as a group, I went and researched it, and it came up that the Quaker meeting that I was raised in with my dad's family in Maryland is now a National Historic Register. Is that how you say it? National? And on the plaque is the connection of my relative to Betsy Ross.
Oh, so they proved it for you.
Right.
Oh,
And I just brought it in to show Rob. I said,
I want more good luck like that
I
as I'm doing
know.
these
I
projects.
just couldn't believe it because
I'm just really good at the dead ends.
you know,
so.
I when I started this, this is a little town in Maryland, and I he said, put in the name of one of your relatives and find a grave. And this whole thing came up, and it's true. I ended up being able to prove the connection to Betsy Ross, as well as find that we have an old Quaker family meeting house that I used to go to with my parents every
That you were
year.
connected to.
And now it's a National Historic Register.
Well, I would say
But
that.
all these lies ended up, being uncovered.
Yeah.
But
It's interesting. The Ancestry is so helpful, and they're constantly getting more information. Google is surprisingly helpful, and Google is how I found this long-lost relative of ours. Because I put in an address to figure out if a house was still standing, and some random guy's name came up, and I contacted him just to say, your random name came up, connected with my family, and he was the half-brother of my mother's first cousin in South Africa, and he was doing the research on her behalf to help her out, and so that came out of Google. It came through WikiTree. So.
a family search, I think, had an ancestry tree, and that's how the lady in London found me.
Those are always fun too, because you find all kinds of mistakes on there. So it's great when you can kind of pull out the facts that you know are true, and people they're so excited to find a fact, they'll just throw it on their tree, and then the name is spelled wrong, it's from a completely different space. So that to me, I found the mistakes almost as fun as the actual stuff. So.
Vincent,
Yes, what kind of search in Google would you use? What wording?
In this particular one, what I put in, I found the birth certificate for my grandfather, and there was an address associated with it. And all I wanted to do was know whether the building was still standing. I put the address in, and when I did that, somebody else had been also, they put it into their tree with the address. So it just happened that because we were both looking at the same thing, I was able to see it, and Google connected me with WikiTree.
Right.
With this entry. So it was just, again, serendipity is like 90% of what goes on here.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
I want to say something. She has a couple of closing chapters in your book, like one on essentially the value of historic restoration, and not, I really appreciated you connecting this past to things that matter today.
Tangible things are really important. So even though these are pretty fake, so I don't know who the antiques experts are here, tangible things, including buildings, are really important. So the research that I did on the house would have been much less interesting if I was doing it on a piece of land than on the house that I knew people had been in. When we moved in the house, we discovered something in the attic, and it turned out it was a dumbwaiter that had gone through the house. And those things are really important to know sort of who walked the hallways. So the last chapter of my book is called Why Historic Preservation Matters. And it's economic as well as whatever you want to call it, cultural. So.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And let me just comment. Yes, Ralph?
The value of these little books that I showed you, it's immeasurable to me now, because look what dropped out of one of them. This is a photo of a brother of my grandfather, Byron Wadley, with his load of oxen all loaded with hay. Now, wow, I gotta really look through these books now. Maybe there are more photos. Huh? Really?
Let me just make, I want to make a few additional comments. One is, if you are interested in trying to find out more about this Dorothy Nickerson, I did stand up a little tree and worked on something, collected some fundamental known information and so forth. And just tell me, and I can share that tree with you in edit mode. And we can have a collaboration and see if we can find some improved evidence for who this Dorothy Nickerson is. And let me go back to the slides here to remind myself, I think we want to say something about our next talk, for instance. Yes? Next month. It's the same pattern. We start at 10 a.m., the talk at 10:30 a.m., And the title of this talk is Genetic Genealogy, Empathy in the NPE community. NPE is not the parent expected. Some people call it MPE, that's a fancier term, misattributed parental event. And so anyway, and I feel like it's important to read this. NPE is what happens when a person takes a consumer DNA test and discovers that their biological parent is not the parent expected. It is often a shock for individuals, and the discovery can trigger conflict and rejection, both in the family they were raised with and in the biological family as well. We will explore the history and culture surrounding how we identify family and how consumer DNA testing has reframed these concepts. Students will gain, or listeners, will gain insights into the challenges faced by those experiencing NPE, developing empathy and practical skills for supporting individuals through this turbulent journey of self-discovery. The course aims to equip participants with the knowledge and sensitivity needed to approach genetic surprises with understanding and grace.